Hey everyone, and welcome to the Anika Apple Podcast Live. This is our December installment of the Divine Guidance, and I'm excited to be with you today. I have quite a bit that God has shared with me for divine guidance for today, and so we'll get into that in just a second. Just to start, I like to start our episodes with a message from me to you, entitled "From My Heart to Yours," and I'll just tell you what I am sending to your heart today. Um, as I think about the holidays, I'm always reflecting on how much we can get caught up in the swirl of what happens for everyone else. Like, what is it that everyone else needs? And, we're busy doing Black Friday shopping and all of the things to care for and to entertain and to support and celebrate the holiday parties, the end of the year work, closing out client engagements, all of the things that we do that are so outwardly focused. And as a coach and advisor, I think a lot about, the way that I close out my year, making sure that I have a good plan for what I'm doing with my clients in the upcoming year. And again, all of those things are focused on the outward pieces. I want to encourage you to take a moment to really think about your emotional, physical, psychological, and spiritual well being. What are you doing to nurture those parts of yourself? If you think of those four parts as all parts of the body, there are ways for us to ensure that we are taking care of ourselves so that we are resilient, so that we can continue to make good, sound choices about the way we show up in the world for other people, the way we support them, whether it's from family or from our engagements at work, et cetera, so forth. So, how are you nurturing your spirit? For many of you, you might be thinking about your plans for 2025, and you already have a business plan. You already have plans for your individual coaching or personal development. And for some, you may not have thought about those things yet. It's important for you to have a plan to take care of you. So while you're busy doing all of the things and celebrating as you should, make sure that you are carving out time to think about what you need. Spiritually, you might consider strengthening some of the practices that you do to connect to source, to the divine, to God, on a regular basis, whether that's prayer, doing devotionals, if that is meditation, if it is doing breath work, whatever the practices are, ensuring that you have a regular way that you're connecting will be helpful to you. Another thing that I would encourage you to think about is what the things are that you need emotionally. And so, how do you strengthen your awareness of your emotions? How often do you have time by yourself and you reflect on the way that you felt during the day or the impact of different situations and conversations that you might have had? Do you notice yourself swallowing your emotions? Do you feel that kind of tightness in your throat or in your chest when you need to have conversations that are highly emotionally charged? Because those are signs for you that there's work for you to do there. You might think about physically how you keep yourself energized as you go through the holiday season. One of the easiest things for us to fall off from is exercise or our good eating regimens, right? And so, what are some of the ways that you'll plan ahead to take care of yourself? As someone who eats plant based, in entirety, I look at menus ahead of time before I go places and identify what it is that I can eat. Or I make sure I have a protein shake before I go. Like, there are ways for you to prepare yourself physically. And then psychologically, I want to just call your attention to this. Stress is one of those things that we hold in our bodies. It actually becomes physically manifested for us. And a lot of times when we're dealing with something, we're not. We don't realize that the way that we're responding to that particular trigger or stimuli ends up being something that will physically manifest itself in our bodies later. And so what we want to make sure that we're doing is that we are identifying what those psychological triggers, what the psychological stimuli is in our lives, and that we have an active way that we're navigating through that. I love meditation and prayer, because it covers all of those things for me. In prayer, I always ask God to show me me, and then God shows me the things that are happening within myself that can connect even emotionally. And so I get to see and reflect back on the way I've shown up at things, and I get to have conversations with God about like what could have been better or different. So I think that is one of the best ways that I have found to take care of myself. The other I would say is meditation, because in meditation I find that just the solidarity of reflecting and holding space for myself, sometimes things emerge that I don't even realize or are top of mind for me, or impacting my body. And so those are some things that I would encourage you to think about as we go into the holiday season. So I want to get into our main part of our podcast today, which is the divine guidance for December. This divine guidance is covering some of the pieces are more immediate term, and that means like in the next 3 to 6 months, and some of them are a little bit further out, which typically for me, I genuinely see um, usually about 18 to 24 months out. Um, yeah, about 18 to 24 months. Mhm. Some of this will be even further out than that, but a lot of it is going to be nearer term. And so the other day in prayer, God gave me a pretty significant download about what's happening. And there's some specific words that I want to call out to you. One thing I will tell you on the front end, as God is leading me through this, to share with you that there are there is a journey around words for us. Um, the best way to say it is that words have a particular meaning and experience for us based on what we have been taught. And sometimes the meanings of those words are really attached to the way that man sees and describes them, and that is different than the way God sees them. Destruction is a really great example of this. So a couple of years ago, God was talking to me about destruction, and I was like, "This is not like you are a God of love. Like this is not destruction. It's just I don't get it, right?" And of course, it's not that we don't see destruction in the Bible. Of course, we do, but what God is was referring to is that there has to be sometimes a wiping out of what exists systematically, process wise, our typical thought patterns, in order for you to create a foundation that is good and healthy and solid, that's based in truth. Because to just knock something down, like if you imagine a tall building, if there was a crack in the foundation, to just go and pull out the part that's rotted and create a little bit of a foundation there, a new foundation, it would still allow that whole foundation to be tainted. And so when God's talking about destruction, this does not go out and destroy the world. This is really about us looking at how systems and processes need to be dismantled. And that starts with what is inside of you. So the systems and the processes that you are operating in, that are operating through you, those things need to often be dismantled. And a lot of our thought process related to the meanings of words comes from what we hear from other people. It comes from what we have been taught. And what God is requiring of us is that we're spending more time with God, asking God, what do these words mean? So I've described to you destruction in one of the best ways that I can. And that is a very simplistic understanding of what God has shared with me with destruction, but enough for us to be able to hold the space on the podcast. What your work would then be is to take the word destruction back to God and say, what does this mean? So that you get clarity around what it means for you, and also that God can continue to reveal to you that which you should know about the word. So when I tell you the words that God has said, I don't want you to immediately go to the way you think about these words in your physicalness, because it would be a waste of time for you to make an assumption about what it means. You have to take it to God to understand what the implications are for you. Um, let me just pause and say, more than ever before, for those of you that are familiar with the divine guidance and who listened to divine guidance last year around the summertime when I talked about the tunnel, we talked about how people were making choices. Are you following the light, following God's path, or following the man's path, right? And depending upon what you chose and how you have continued to operate since then, there are going to be things that don't apply to you in the same way it will to someone else. And so, to people hearing this who maybe have chosen differently as you were coming through the tunnel, you need to take it back to God to have an understanding of what it means to you, because it won't mean the same thing for everyone. If you chose to walk in the light, then you are going to really deeply understand how I explain things to you today. If you chose not to walk in the light, you may understand some of them, but in terms of the way it applies to your actual life, you need to go sit with God, because your pathway is different, right? They're choices, and we've all made choices. And so that's basically what it comes down to. So first and foremost, the two words that God gave me were revolt and uprising. These are big. Um, there is something about revolt that we will want to um, intonate based on what we are seeing out in the world. And for those of you that sit in the US where I live, we've just gone through an election. We see a lot of craziness that's been out and about. And it would be really easy for us to say, well, that's what people are revolting against. They're revolting against hate, or, they don't like the outcome of the election, or whatever the case may be. This is not that. This starts at home. This revolt is about you looking at the choices and decisions that you make. What are you standing for? What are you following? What edicts have you allowed yourself to align to that is not what God is showing you? And so the first part of revolt happens in yourself. What are you now choosing to disagree with that has been a foundation of who you have been in your humanness? You have to it's like turning away from the way the world does things in order to do things in alignment with what God does. And that matters so much, because our deepest protection for whatever it is to come, and this is appropriate for anywhere in the world, our protection is in God. Like, God is the one with the plan, is the one with a deep understanding and knowledge of what is to come, and is who is fully equipped to protect us. So whether you call God source, the divine, whatever it is, that is where we have to be in alignment with. And so part of the work for you is to begin to look at, what are the things that I have been aligning myself with that no longer are mirroring what God has said to me about who I am and what I'm called to be in this lifetime. You'll want to do that work. The other is uprising. And so this uprising, again, encouraging you to go back and ask God specifically about the word for you. I'm probably going to say that multiple times as we go through the podcast. But the other part of uprising is that there should be a recognition that as we made our pathway through the tunnel, the people who've chosen light, they're walking in a way that is just simply different. The boldness that exists is just simply different. The power that God has anointed them with is just something different. People have not seen this kind of uprising of spirit and spirituality, of truth, of God's light in this way before. And people are beginning to understand that even the way that we practice religion cannot stand in the way of what it is that God is trying to do. God is not trying to do things through separation. I've said this before. If you see things that are separation and they're not operating from a place of love, you immediately need to go back and take it to God and say, is this you? What am I not seeing that may be present that looks like it's not of love, right? Or that looks like it's not working to bring people together? Because what God desires is that all men, everyone, comes together in alignment. This is not about an agenda of separation. That's not God's plan. And so we have to understand that the separation is first man from the physicalness of his identity, from the way that we think things are supposed to go in the world, to be more aligned with who we have been divinely created to be, that we would sit in our divinity and understand what it is that God desires for us to bring into the world, that we walk in our purpose, that we bring light, that we are conveyors of love, that we are followers of God's truth. That's the work, not the truth that man has handed to us. And I know that that can be complex for us, because so many of us who've grown up in the church, etc., have grown up learning certain things, but there is a call to understand God in a much more broad way. God is incredibly expansive. And a lot of times in the fearfulness of humans, we try to make God small. We try to make God fit in a box, and that does not work. And so we're finding that we're seeing a lot of the reaction of that, the reflection of that happening in the world. Okay, so next thing I will say to you is that the split has begun. So as I talked about the choices in the tunnels, one of the things that God shared through me is that there would also be this split of the earth, right? It's like the earth is in two parts and they're happening there. The earth is turning at the same time, but people are having totally different experiences. So for example, I might be having, the height of all of the seasons in my life, right? Things may be in full abundance, and my neighbor, my very next door neighbor, might be having the opposite experience. And so part of that is what we will see in this time. The split has already happened. It's already beginning. You're already starting to see examples of it. It does not mean that for people who chose light that we will only experience things that are, quote unquote, good. We will still experience a lot of the grief that happens. We will experience grief even watching the choices that people made in the tunnel. Some of us have already begun to experience that with our loved ones, and more of you are going to see that. So as this split is continuing to happen, God has shared that we are going to find moments where we cannot hear what each other is saying. So for example, people who did not choose the light, they might hear what people are saying sounding like gibberish. Like they literally are going to hear them like whatever they're saying does not make any sense. And what God is saying is because the separation creates this differentiation of how we see and understand what it is that God is sharing with us. So if you could think of an example of what it reminds me of is like this example where there's a classroom full of college students, and they did this exercise, right? And this person like runs into the room, disturbs the class. I don't remember if he took somebody's purse or something like that, but it was all staged, right? And if you talk to each of the individuals, they had some different ways that they saw the same experience, right? Like some people described what the person was wearing differently. Some people said they had a mask on. Other people said they didn't have a mask, but they all witnessed the same thing at the same time. So it's very much like that. We're witnessing and experiencing the same thing, but what we are going to hear and know is going to be different based on the choices that we have taken. God said, I will speak to the hearts of those that I have called and who desire the truth. And so if someone like myself is sharing message out to the world, people who are going to hear it with their heart are those who truly have been seeking after God, desiring God's truth. They're the ones who've chosen the light. God promises that the promised land will be reached by those who do desire truth and desire God, or seeking after God consistently. God also guaranteed that the children nursed at our bosom would be there as well. This is a really big deal because the children have been under massive warfare and they're continuing to experience that. We'll have to watch the way that we cover our children in prayer, because they are coming into their gifting in a way that is different than what we've ever seen in the history of certainly our lifetime, my generation, but the history of the generations that are alive today. And because they're coming so quickly into their gifting, they are a prime target for the adversary. And so caring for them, nurturing them, not discouraging their gifting, but encouraging them to sit with God is really important. Recognizing who they are, learning to identify their gifts, learning to nurture their gifts matters. The next thing that God shared with me is that in the same way that homes were marked on the door to mark the time of Passover, to cover for Passover, that we are to mark our vessels in the same way. And we do that for those of you like myself who are followers of Christ. We do that with the blood of Christ. But it's the blood of Christ. It is truth and love that will set us apart. And so when you think about how you mark your vessel, like what is it that you are doing? This is not just about the physicalness of your vessel, but it is about how you identify with truth and love and light. It's how you identify with those things. And so in order for us to mark our vessel, we have to be having ongoing ongoing conversations with God. We've got to be clear that we are connected to the divine and that we are not being led astray, because it is very easy to be distracted by what people are doing in their humanness, especially when people are using fear mongering as a key tactic, which is something that we will definitely experience in the months ahead, in the days ahead and the months ahead. The next thing, God showed me that destruction could be all around us, right? But for those who have been earnestly seeking after God, who've chosen to walk in the pathway that God has aligned for them, God showed me that there was a dome over them. And this dome was like a cake plate. It's the best way that I could describe it. So if you think about the platter being the place of safety, it reminds me of Psalm 91, but it's like the place of safety where God has you, and that dome cover is over you. It's like when you are speaking to Psalm 91, you are declaring that you are covered and safe during the time with whatever it is that might be going on around you. And that's God's promise. And so part of our standing on God's promise is believing that even though I'm in the midst of these storms and challenges, God still has me. And what God said is that when we are in those spaces of protection for God's children, that we need to remember that we are in safety and that we know the way to the promised land. So, what could it mean for you to find yourself in the midst of challenge, but know that you are safe and that you know the way home? You know the way to the promised land. And sometimes that way is being still in the midst of the storm happening, right? So, a lot of what we are going to need to use in the time up ahead is patience. Here, let me create a colorful reference for you. Imagine that you're at a large scale event, like a concert, right? And all of a sudden you hear a noise, it's like a loud bang, and you see people running. Well, your immediate thing is to run. God is telling us, like, what if you recognize that you are in a place of safe haven, and instead of running because you don't really know what's happening, you don't know what direction you're going to run into whatever trouble it is that people are hearing, you just follow the crowd and you don't really know. What if in that moment you are still until you hear from God? In your stillness, when you hear from God, then you can get the instruction of how to go. You can get the instruction. God can bring back to your memory what you already know about where to go and how to get there. So this commitment that we make it to the promised land requires that we are in alignment with God. We're listening to God and we are still in the safety. Sometimes the stillness is a part of the protection. You're still until the danger passes, and then you can have safe passage to where you're going. There will be times where the masses around you are riled up about things that are happening in the world that you don't have control over, but God does. God has full control over what happens to you. You just have to be still long enough to see what God is doing play out in your life. And I know that sometimes that's difficult, but practice stillness and patience now so you're prepared. The next big thing that God showed me is significant bio warfare. I've been talking about food supply for probably a year and a half now. What I would tell you is that the food supply is a big, big, big concern. The first thing that God showed me were people, they were all dressed in black and they were kneeling at the side of a body of water. It looked kind of like a lake or a river, and they were kneeling there. They did not put their hands in the water, but they were leaning over the side of let's call it the riverbank, and they were praying over the water, but they would not touch the water, and the water was being poisoned. And God said many will become sick because of it. And God calls us back to something that is so important, which is prayer. We probably have not realized the true importance of prayer. Prayer over our meals has become something that's commonplace. God was speaking to me about this like a year or so ago. But this came back really saliently on Friday. Like when we are praying, we need to be thinking about what intention we are utilizing to cover our food and water as we get ready to ingest it. Because prayer has become routine, because we don't seriously cover our food, there is the opportunity for it to be tainted. God had said to me a while ago that water, which is energy, which is more than 70% of what our bodies are made up of. We should be praying for that, praying as we get ready to drink that water every time we drink water to supercharge it, right? And to call forward that we want the water to energize our cells, that we want it to remove toxins from our body, to call upon the healing that exists in water to do what it needs to do in our bodies. And food, in the way that it has been manufactured, the way that things are being tainted, we've seen most of what God showed me last year. There have been chicken recalls, there's been beef recalls. We're still seeing things that are tainted with vegetables. We just had an E. coli. I just got a call a couple days ago from Target about some carrots, like that we probably bought a couple of months ago. But like there are things and are going to continue to be things. And one of the things that God showed me is this manufacturing plant. And this manufacturing plant had sheets of plastic, and they were creating plastic food. It was like during the daytime, if there were to be an inspection, the plant looked normal. Like this is normally, they're running chickens through there or whatever it is, right? But at night, they were running some lines that were shut off during the day, and there was plastic. There were sheets of plastic. This is not just about the microplastics that people have been talking about in food and in drinks, but they were sheets of plastic, and they were making it look like chicken. It looked exactly like it, and when you touched it, it bounced. Like it absolutely looked like real chicken. And the intent was to get more plastic into people's bodies. And God said, the more plastic that is being infused into the body, the impact that they're desiring to get is that it shuts down the heart. This is supposed to highlight for us the overdependence on import and export. And then God gave me some specific places. I'm not going to call those places out in this video, but I will say that, seek God, and I'm sure God will show you what it is. But there were some specific countries that God talked about. This connection that we have to importing and exporting goods has created an over reliance on places. And when you don't understand the agenda attached to the places that you are purchasing products from, there is a problem. We have walked away from the self-reliance that God created for and within us. This does not mean that we should not depend on one another, but it does mean that we cannot assume that everyone else has our best interest in heart. We have to recognize that sometimes there are agendas that we may not fully understand, and that by just saying yes to whatever that agenda is, you allow yourself to be in the position to be victimized. So what does that mean for us? Well, there's got to be some work that we do around understanding how things are approved for consumption in the countries with which we live in. The other thing would be, what can you do to create a source of food supply for yourself, for your families, for your community that is sustainable? There's definitely some work for us to do there. The other thing that God showed me was more around the earth separation. So I mentioned that the split has already begun because God told me to say that up front. And what God was showing me basically was like there was a stream of lava that looked like it was flowing from the sun, and it was separating the earth. And the part of it that it looked like where the lava was running along the earth was like a larger side on the right, a smaller side on the left, and it was like being like almost melted away, and eventually that section was just no more. It was like just burned away. And what God was showing me is that there's so much of how we see things in the world today where we are looking with our humanness. We're looking to understand it in the context of what we've experienced, right? Like we understand that context is made up of what we have been told, what we've read, what we were taught when we were children, and what we've experienced. But the context of what's happening in the world is so much broader than just the things that we can contextualize. We cannot fully understand all of what is happening now. And so what God showed me is that the eyes of man were burned, like they were burned literally, just looking like they were skin and kind of healing, um without being able to physically, see the eyeballs. Like it was deep. And God was saying that we have to recognize that in this time we will need God's eyes to see. And what that means for us is that we get to make a decision to not trust our humanness, to not trust our eyes. Instead, that we should be sitting with God and saying, help me understand what's happening, what's present for me here, what do I need to understand or know or shift so that I can be in full alignment with what God desires for us. The last thing that God showed me is that this is a time where, related to this, like seeing with God's eyes, there's so much that is being sent in our direction to create confusion. I was hearing, I've put a spell on you, and that there are so many people who are sleepwalking. And it's the best description that I can use for it. It's like sleepwalking through life. And we don't recognize the various mediums that have created these spells. What we think is good is actually tainting us when we don't take those things before God. If you take various mediums as an example before God, God will tell you what it is that is appropriate for you. And again, because we are all not the same, we're not all experiencing the same things, we're not all called to the same assignment, you cannot assume that what you see one person doing works for you. For example, I can think of several of, like in my group of friends, I can think of several people who went through this period of time where they loved to watch the news and they stopped watching the news altogether, while other people who typically didn't watch the news were starting to watch more of the news. But God was telling them very specifically where they should watch, what they should watch, and all of this stuff. As someone who believes that you need information in order to understand what's happening, that context and perspective matters, I find that I do want to have an understanding of what's going on in the world, but that cannot surpass what God says is wise. If you knew that there was an intention to taint the way you see the world, what would you do differently? If you knew someone was putting glasses on you to make sure you saw the world differently, would you remove those glasses? I know you're saying, of course I would. And so the question you have to ask yourself is, then why have I not sat with God to ensure that whatever it is I'm consuming is right for me and is right for me in this time? We have to do better with the way in which we are covering what we consume in our bodies physically, what we eat, what we are consuming in terms of what we are watching, what we are reading, what we are listening to, what we're allowing those people around us to listen to, particularly the children and those of us who sit in more vulnerable states. And then also the way in which we allow fear to creep in. And as someone who's been on a deep healing journey, I will tell you, fear has been one of the most challenging things. God said to me a while ago, you are the generator of your own fear, which means that somehow, in some way, when things come up, it's reflecting back some fear that's on the inside of me. We have to do a really good job with navigating through that fear, getting to the root of where the fear comes from, countering the fear with the word of God and the promises of God so that we can move forward boldly, because we are not going to have what we felt was security and control that we used to have in experiences before. What I mean by that is there are times where you have felt like you were in more control of whatever it was that's going on in your life, and you will no longer have that. There's a lot to come. There is a lot to come. There are a lot of experiences to come. There are a lot of shifts to come. And I probably said about, I don't even know how many times, but that there are things that are going to happen in places that we thought never would ever happen in a place like that. And this is just, it just is what it is. It just is what we will see and experience through the middle of next year. And so with that, knowing that, you really don't or never really truly had control, because that's just the truth, right? Knowing that we don't always have full understanding and context of things, knowing that we can't always see all of the details. Even as a prophet of God, I don't have every piece to everything that God is doing all at one time. And so we have to be able to be clear about what we're trusting in. God's challenge to us is that we trust in God, that we trust in the divine in ways that we probably have not even ascended to yet in our humanness. That when you cannot see the why, when you cannot understand why things are happening, you still stand boldly and confidently on God's promises and believe that situations will turn around. God has been strengthening your faith specifically, so that you will be ready for the time up ahead. Don't allow the challenges that have come avert your eyes from God. We need the exact opposite. As we look at and we start to hear about and start to see and experience these things that we never thought we would go through, we need to be clinging more tightly to God than ever before. And what I can tell you is any practice, any skill, anything that we want to strengthen, a muscle that we want to use, starts with our gravitating to God clearly and fully now. Because if you are in solidarity with God, if you are praying, if you are constantly seeking after God and asking God to show you, asking God to reveal truth to you, asking God to help you understand who you are and your purpose, it won't be difficult for you when you go through whatever it is that you are going to experience. I want to come back to one point. I talked earlier about how, we experienced the split, and that this piece about gibberish, right? Like, people who are not postured for the truth are going to hear things and it's going to sound like gibberish to them, right? In the same way, you may be hearing things that are not true, begin to hear those things that are not true and cast them aside. Pay attention to what is truly resonating with you as truth versus what you'd like to believe because contextually it makes sense. They are not the same thing. You want to strengthen your discernment, and you do that by spending your time with God. By the way, asking for discernment is a real thing. That is a real prayer. Asking God to help you discern, asking God to help you understand, asking God to help you see where your weaknesses are when it comes to listening to the things that people propagate out in the world. Like, those things are absolutely within your control. That is absolutely what you should be going to God to say. Help me have stronger discernment and understanding for what's happening in the world. Help me to be prepared. Help me to know what it is that you desire for me. How may I be of service? What are the ways in which you need me to bring your light and love into the world? And in the midst of everything that we will experience, God will still expect of us that we are exactly that, light and love. God will still expect of us that we are the example. Because as we go through the things that are to come, there will be many who sit in places of confusion. And they're going to see some places that look like they have power because man has created these constructs to look like it's power that surpasses all things, right? But we know that's not true. And people will look to the other side and they will see those who perhaps look like they're not in a place of power, but actually have real power because of their connection to God, because God is the power within, right? And what we desire the outcome to be is that those people who are sitting in this moment of confusion look and want to know the God that you serve. They look and they want to be connected to what is true, what is love. We cannot be the examples that God has created us to be in this world and not exemplify love. We simply cannot. Love doesn't mean that we have to tolerate and accept things that are not of God. It doesn't mean that. But it does mean the way that we treat each other has to look like God's version of love, not what man has been teaching, not what man has been selling, not the way that man operates. So this split has begun. You can no longer do things in the way that you have been doing them before. And for those of you who have really been on your journey around standing boldly in your purpose, you know exactly what I'm talking about. You're going to find more and more of that friction with you of knowing what it is that you're purposed to do and still operating in the way that you have been. They no longer go together. And so you are going to find that if you're experiencing that conflict, you're going to come back to these choice points over and over and over again until you get to a place where you are comfortable saying, I know who I am. I understand my identity in God. I know what I'm purposed to do, and I'm ready to do that. God's desire is that for all of their children. And when I say all, I mean every living, breathing human being. God's desire is that they all know God, that they all are aligned with their purpose, and they all are aligned with building what we will experience as the promised land. But we know that that is not the same agenda as the adversary. And we know that that is not the way that things are all happening in the world. And it is not for us to be fearful. It is for us to stand boldly in the truth of who we know God to be and what we know God's desire to be for their children. That is our divine guidance for the month of December. There was a lot here. And, I always encourage you to take everything that I or anyone else who gives a prophetic release to take it back to God. You got to know that you know that you know. Take it back to God. Let God affirm and confirm what you have heard, and also show you what it means specifically for you in your life. What does it mean for you? I would be really careful about what you consume. And I mean that again in all senses of the word. This is definitely a time to question what you listen to. It is a time to question what you watch, how much time you watch, all of those things, as well as really caring about what you are physically putting into your body, consuming it through eating and drinking, because it really does matter. There's going to be some things that come out about food, and I'm seeing August of next year as a really big time that are just going to be like devastating. Just like, the things that are being spread now around vaccinations and stuff like that. Who knows what's true, what's not true? God does. And so you take that information to God and say, did I make the right choices? Did I make those choices and decisions in alignment with you? Did I do what you asked me to do? And what we have to understand is that, again, just because I'm talking to all the people who know that you know that you know that you know that you have chosen God and to walk in alignment with God. Even though we may have all chosen that path in the tunnel, our assignments are not the same. They're not the same. We may all be honoring God, but our assignments are not the same. So you cannot assume that you will understand why God tells you to do something and tells someone else to do something else, because you're not the same. You don't have the same assignment. You don't have the same ways that you're supposed to show up. You don't have the same audiences of people that you're supposed to speak to or influence or impact. You don't have the same path and experience as others. So think of it this way. If two people went to the doctor and were diagnosed with the same thing, their course of treatment might be different. And it would be a multitude of different factors, right? It could be some health issues or things like that. It might have to do with whether or not they have high blood pressure or any other conditions they're dealing with. It might have to do with, their ability to take pills or whatever the case may be. But they look into the different things and come up with what the best course of action would be for that individual. God is no different. So know that just because your path may look different than someone who did also choose God in the tunnel, it doesn't mean that there is something wrong. If there's something important about having similarity to someone else, you should take that first to God so that you understand what God's desire is. But don't worry about your path looking the same as everybody else's, because your assignment is not the same. And as much as we don't understand all of our full assignment, like every part of our assignment, other people don't understand it either. God said to me a couple of years ago, I was having a conversation with God, and I said, why haven't you shown, this person, people, what have you, who I am? And God said, because what good would it be to show someone else if you haven't fully accepted it for yourself? So think about that. As you're learning what your assignment is and understanding your identity in God, you have to get grounded in that before God can reveal any of that to anyone else. And so there should be more about you that you know and understand and are walking in than what other people around you experience. Expect that to be so. Of course, there are some situations and circumstances where people might have some more insight because they may be someone who's helping to carry you forward, helping you birth you on your journey, right? But for the most part, you will find that people don't have that level of clarity that you do about your assignment, and they don't need it. It's not required. God's in control. So I like to end my podcast episodes with an Ask Anika Anything question. And today I just have a divine question that came through as I was preparing to come on the podcast. And God said to answer the question, how do I prepare? This is a really simple one-word answer: pray. Pray. That's how you prepare. Pray. You should be praying all throughout the day. You know, the Bible says pray without ceasing. But in any, whatever your religious beliefs, whatever your spiritual beliefs are, conversation with the divine, with God, that is what's required. And people put a lot of conditions on prayer and what it's supposed to look like and all of these things. And I would just tell you the posture of your heart matters, that you come open to hearing God, not just to hear yourself talk to God and tell God what you like and what you don't like or what you want, but that you really come to witness and experience God, that you're willing to surrender what you believe to be true to hear what it is that God desires for you to know, that you earnestly want a relationship with God. That's how you're going to prepare for what is to come. There are not answers for everything that is up ahead. And some things are still undetermined. There are still choices and decisions that people are making that are going to influence the events, even the things that other prophets have spoken about. I can tell you, there just are some things that people believe to be true and they can still shift. And that's just where God has things in this moment. And so how can you be prepared when there's so much uncertainty around you, when we don't know exactly what's going to happen? We're not, exactly sure what to do and all these things. I can't tell you how to solve the import export thing, right? Or how to shut down this manufacturing plant with these sheets of plastic. But what I can tell you is grow your own herbs, grow your own vegetables, right? But if you go to God and say specifically, what is it that I am intended to do? Perhaps you are someone who's supposed to start a community farm. Maybe there is something that God desires from you specifically that will help to be preparation for you, your family, and for others. Maybe God just simply wants you to be in a position, a posture of prayer as often as possible so that you are fighting in the spirit, so that what we experience here on earth is more peace. Maybe it is just simply about you understanding who you are so that you will honor the full power and authority that God has given you. Because you're someone who's going to create change. You're a catalyst. You're someone who's going to shift things for the world. So how you prepare is prayer. And it does not take more than a conversation and a pure heart, an earnest heart. And when I say pure, it's not that you have to be in a place of perfection, but it's just you going to God and saying, I just open myself up to you, God. Purify my heart. People will tell you there's words to say and all of these things and all of that stuff. And it's not wrong. There certainly are words that you can say. But what I'm telling you is that what God cares about most is your heart, the condition and the posture of your heart, that you earnestly want a relationship. And part of our saying yes to God, for those of us that did and are clear that we are continuing to choose God every day, we have to stay in relationship with God. We're called for that. Right now it's 111, and 111 is significant because it is a reminder to remember who you are in God, to know who you are in God. And understanding your identity comes from God, because it's only God that can help you truly see and know it. And in this moment, I want to remind you that the very relationship that we're talking about nurturing through prayer is the same relationship that put purpose in your belly before you were born. It's why you're here. It's where your assignment came from. It's where your truth comes from. It's all of those things. So you really are just having conversation with the Creator, the one who loves you most without fail. So I encourage you to spend that time in preparation, because that is truly what is required. Thank you for watching this episode of the Anika Apple podcast. I encourage you to share this. This is a little bit different today in terms of the divine guidance. Typically, God gives me a couple of themes and then just flows through me. But what God shared with me the other day, they told me very specifically that I was to share this in detail today. And so I hope that for many of you, it helped create some understanding. I hope that even more, it creates questions that you will take back to God, that you will sit with God, and encourages you to stand boldly in the truth of who you are, as I stand boldly in the truth of who I am. As always, I wish you peace and blessings and look forward to seeing you next episode. Take care.